My husband invited his mistress to our daughter's funeral and introduced her to everyone as my future wife. I said nothing until she walked over, hugged me, and whispered, "Thank you for finally letting him go." That's when I realized he'd lied to both of us about the same night. It was 11:40 on a Tuesday morning, 6 days after my daughter died on Route 9, and I was standing in the receiving line at Callahan and Whitmore Funeral Home in a navy dress I'd bought for Nora's college graduation. A graduation that was never going to happen now, when my husband, Daniel, walked a woman I'd never met up to me and said, "Elena, this is Nicole. Nicole, my wife." He said it the way you'd introduce a coworker. Then he put his hand on the small of Nicole's back, looked around at the 15 or 20 people still lingering near the casket, and said, loud enough for half the room to hear, "This is my future wife." A woman near the guest book actually gasped. Someone's chair scraped against the floor. My own mother's hand found my elbow, her grip tightening the way it used to when I was small and about to run into traffic, an old reflex neither of us had used in 30 years suddenly back online. The funeral home smelled like lilies and the particular cold of an air conditioner working too hard against a room full of bodies, and somewhere behind me I could hear the low murmur of people deciding, in real time, whether they'd actually heard what they thought they'd heard. And I stood there in front of my dead daughter's open casket and said nothing at all, because my body had already decided, before my brain caught up, that screaming wasn't going to bring Nora back, and it also wasn't going to get me the truth. Silence would. So I let Nicole hug me. I let her press her cheek against mine and say, so quietly it was almost just breath, "Thank you for finally letting him go." And I smiled at her, because I needed her to keep talking, and I needed Daniel to keep thinking his two lies could survive being in the same room. I'd been married to Daniel for 19 years. I run patient services at Ridgeview Memorial, a job that means I spend my days translating bad news into next steps, a diagnosis into a treatment plan, a death into paperwork, a family's panic into something they can hold on to. Daniel sold analytics software for a company called Corvail, and he was good at it in the specific way that made me trust him for 2 decades. He never overpromised, he always followed up, and he could make you feel like the only person in the room. We'd had one bad stretch, 3 years back, an emotional affair he swore never went further than texting, 6 weeks of counseling with a woman named Dr. Aldana, who made us do worksheets about attachment styles, and then it was over, and we didn't talk about it again. I told myself we'd survived something. I didn't know yet that I'd just learned what it looked like when he got caught the first time, and filed away exactly which lies had worked. What I remember most about that counseling stretch looking back isn't the worksheets. It's how quickly Daniel learned to give Dr. Aldana exactly the answer that ended a session early. He'd say things like, "I understand now that omission is its own kind of dishonesty," in a voice so steady it sounded rehearsed, and Dr. Aldana would nod and move the conversation along, and I would sit there feeling like the only person in the room who noticed he'd answered the question without actually answering it. I told myself that was just how he talked in meetings, that salespeople are trained to sound resolved even when they're not. My younger sister, Julia, who never liked him the way the rest of my family did, used to say Daniel had a gift for making you feel crazy for still having the question after he'd already delivered the tone of an answer. I used to defend him against that. I don't anymore. Nora was 16, she ran cross-country, kept a 3.9 GPA she complained about constantly, and edited the opinion page of the Ashwood High paper with a red pen she'd stolen from my desk and never given back. She left a half-empty water bottle on every surface in our house. She had a chipped blue mug she refused to throw out because it was the first thing she'd ever thrown on a pottery wheel, lopsided handle and all, and she drank her coffee from it every single morning while she quizzed herself on vocabulary flashcards out loud. She'd started keeping a running joke that spring about her father missing things. He'd missed her regional meet in February for a client dinner nobody in our family ever heard the name of, and she'd told me at dinner one night, half laughing, that she was starting a list of Dad's mystery meetings on a sticky note in her binder just to see how long it got. I laughed with her. I didn't ask to see the list. I think about that sticky note more than almost anything else from that spring, because my 16-year-old daughter had noticed the shape of something a full month before I did, and had turned it into a joke instead of a warning, because that's what you do with your father's small absences when you have no reason yet to believe they're anything but small. On the night of March 3rd, she had a study group 2 towns over that ran late. Daniel was supposed to pick her up at 7. At 6:52, he texted our family friend Carol Whitfield, whose daughter was in the same study group, stuck in a meeting, running way behind. "Any chance you could grab Nora too? I owe you." Carol said yes, the way she always did. At 7:41, a 29-year-old named Wes Granger ran a red light on Route 9 at 61 miles an hour with a blood alcohol level twice the legal limit and hit the passenger side of Carol's Subaru. Carol survived with a broken collarbone. Nora didn't. I have not since that night been able to stop doing the math on those 49 minutes. I got the call at 8:04. I remember the number on my screen because it wasn't Daniel's. It was a Ridgeview Memorial extension I recognized from my own building, a colleague named Preeti calling from the ER because she knew who I was before the chart even finished loading. I was in the parking garage before I'd hung up the phone. Daniel didn't arrive until 8:51, 47 minutes after I did, and when he came through the sliding doors, his tie was still on, his hair combed, nothing about him looking like a man who'd been stuck in a meeting so urgent it kept him from his own daughter. I didn't notice that detail that night. I was too busy watching a trauma surgeon named named Dr. Okonkwo walked toward us with the particular unhurried posture doctors use when there's no more urgency left to bring, because urgency is for patients who can still be saved. Carol was 2 curtains down, her arm in a temporary sling, crying so hard a nurse had given her a sedative. She kept saying my name. She kept saying, I'm sorry, I should have taken the other road. And I remember holding her hand and telling her none of this was hers to apologize for, not knowing yet how much of it actually belonged to someone else in that waiting room entirely. The first crack came at the funeral itself, and it wasn't loud. It was Nicole's whisper. Thank you for finally letting him go. I hadn't let him go. I hadn't said a single word about a divorce, about an ending, about anything, because until that hug, I hadn't known there was a Nicole to let him go to. I stood there smiling with my daughter's casket 8 feet away and told myself she was confused, that grief does strange things to strangers too, that maybe she'd misheard something secondhand and garbled it into a sentence that made sense to no one but her. That night, after the house had finally emptied of casseroles and cousins, I asked Daniel who she was. He didn't flinch. Nicole Ferris. She works in marketing. We've collaborated on a few accounts. I asked why she'd called herself his future wife in front of my dead daughter's casket. He rubbed his eyes like I was the unreasonable one. She's dramatic, Elena. People say weird things at funerals. You know that better than anyone. You work in a hospital. My stomach had already dropped by then. A physical, specific drop, like a floor giving way 1 inch. I let it go that night. I told myself I had a funeral to survive first, and a marriage to investigate second. Julia called me the next morning before I'd even gotten out of bed. She'd heard about the future wife comment from our cousin, who'd heard it from the woman at the guest book, because 6 days of grief in a small town travels exactly the way gossip always does. Sideways, fast, and slightly wrong by the third telling. You don't have to decide anything today, Julia told me, in the flat, steady voice she used to use on me when we were kids and I'd get too far into my own head about something. You just have to notice what you noticed. I told her I'd noticed a woman I'd never met thank me for letting go of a marriage I hadn't ended. Julia was quiet for a second. Then she said the thing that stuck with me for the rest of that spring. Then somebody's been telling 2 different stories, Elle, and you're the only one who's about to be in the room for both of them. I didn't know yet how literally that would turn out to be true. The second crack was quieter, and I built it myself on purpose over the following week. Daniel's stuck in a meeting text to Carol had been bothering me since the moment I first read it on Carol's phone at the hospital. The 2 of us sitting in plastic chairs while a doctor I didn't recognize used words like massive trauma and nothing anyone could have done. A meeting with who? Corvale didn't run client calls past 6 on a Thursday. I knew that because Daniel complained about it constantly, how his manager, a man named Roy Castellano, insisted everyone log evening meetings for expense purposes. I called Corvale's front desk 2 days after the funeral, telling myself I was just confirming bereavement paperwork for his HR file, and asked casually if there'd been any late meetings logged for Daniel on March 3rd. A receptionist named Georgia put me on hold for 4 minutes and came back sounding puzzled. I'm not showing anything on the calendar system past 4:15 that day, ma'am. Would you like me to check with his manager directly? I said no. I said thank you. I told her it must have been a scheduling error on my end, and she said that happened all the time, and we hung up like 2 people who had just had a completely ordinary conversation, and I sat there afterward with the phone still warm in my hand, thinking about how easily I just lied to a stranger to protect a lie my husband had told me. I hung up and sat outside my closed daughter's bedroom door and stared at her chipped blue mug on the nightstand through the gap in the doorframe, still holding the coffee she never finished, and I felt my hands start shaking in a way they hadn't since the night at the hospital. I told myself, sitting there on the hallway floor in my work clothes, that there were a dozen boring explanations. Maybe it was a personal meeting, something he hadn't wanted logged because it involved a client gift or a bonus he was trying to keep quiet. Maybe Georgia's calendar system only showed internal meetings and not off-site ones. I have spent my whole career trained to rule out the mundane explanation before I escalate to the frightening one, and that training was the only thing keeping me upright on that floor, running through every boring possibility twice before I let myself consider the one that wasn't. I didn't confront him. I told myself I needed more before I said anything, because if I was wrong, I would be accusing a grieving father of lying about the worst night of both our lives, and if I was right, I wanted to already know the whole shape of it before he had a chance to reshape it back. The third crack came from an envelope, and it came from an institution instead of a person, which somehow made it worse. 11 days after the funeral, a letter arrived from Meridian Mutual Insurance, the company that carried Wes Granger's auto policy, informing us that as part of their standard fault review process for a wrongful death claim exceeding certain thresholds, they'd be requesting supplemental documentation from all parties present in the vehicle's planned itinerary that evening, including, the letter specified, location data associated with the original intended transportation arrangement for the minor. A caseworker named Priya Nadkarni, a senior claims investigator with 12 years at Meridian, called 2 days later to explain in plainer language because Daniel had been the originally scheduled driver, and because comparative negligence law in our state allowed defense counsel to argue that any third party's decisions that night could factor into the broader liability picture. They needed his phone's location history and any electronic toll records for his vehicle for that evening. It's routine, Priya told me over the phone, tone, her voice careful in the specific way people get when they've delivered bad news for a living. "It doesn't mean anyone's accusing your husband of anything. It just means everything gets documented." She walked me through the process the way I imagined she'd walked hundreds of grieving families through it before. The itemized request list, the 21-day response window, the difference between what Meridian could compel and what it could only politely ask for. She mentioned, almost in passing, that Detective Reyes's original police report would also be pulled into the file as a baseline document, since any fault review had to start from whatever the initial investigation had already established. I wrote her name and extension down on a sticky note and put it on the refrigerator, next to a school photo of Nora from freshman year, and I didn't think anything else about it for 2 more weeks. She was wrong about the "just means everything gets documented" part, and I don't think she ever knew it, because for Priya, documentation was the goal. For me, it turned out to be the beginning of an entirely different investigation, one she'd started without meaning to. The Easy Pass statement came to our joint account 2 weeks later, and I found it because I was the one who reconciled our bills, the way I'd done for 19 years without ever once looking for anything specific in them. On March 3rd, at 6:47 p.m., Daniel's car had crossed the Ashland Parkway toll plaza. I looked it up on a map with my hands not quite steady on the keyboard. The Ashland Parkway crossing sits 41 minutes from Corvale's downtown office, in the opposite direction of our house, on the opposite side of the county from anywhere he'd ever mentioned having a client. I told myself it was a mistake, a transponder glitch, a coincidence involving someone else's car with a similar plate. I have a hospital administrator's instinct for ruling out the boring explanation before the frightening one. I sat at the kitchen table for almost an hour that first night with the statement open on my laptop next to a map of the county, tracing the route between Corvale's office and the Ashland Parkway crossing with my finger like a woman doing long division by hand, hoping the distance would come out smaller the 3rd time I checked it. It didn't. 41 minutes every time, in the wrong direction entirely. I printed the statement, folded it in half, and carried it around in my bag for 3 days before I found a moment that felt survivable enough to use it in. Then I asked him about it directly, finally, sitting across from him at our kitchen table with the statement printed and face down beside my plate. "Why does your Easy Pass show you at the Ashland Parkway crossing at 6:47 the night Nora died?" His face didn't do what I expected. It didn't panic. It recalculated. "I had a quick detour out that way to see a client before the office thing wrapped," he said evenly, like he'd practiced it, which I understand now. He had, just not for this exact question. "It's not that deep, Elena. I don't remember every errand from a night I've been trying to forget." I didn't push further that night. I sat with the fact that this was the second different story he'd told about those same 2 hours. Stuck in a meeting to Carol, a client detour to me. And neither one had a name attached to it, or a location, or a single detail that could be checked. I went to bed and didn't sleep, and started quietly keeping a folder. The 4th crack didn't come from anything I did. It came from Nicole's own life, and it came through a woman named Fatima Delgado, who I had never met and who, it turned out, had been Nicole's closest friend for 6 years. Fatima worked in Corval's compliance office, 1 floor down from marketing, and in the small, gossiping ecosystem of a mid-sized company. Word travels sideways faster than it travels up. Fatima had heard from someone in claims processing whose cousin worked at Meridian that there had been a toll record discrepancy tied to Daniel Marsh's fault review. She mentioned it to Nicole the way you'd mention any piece of office gossip, not maliciously, just idly, over lunch, sitting in the break room with a salad she never finished. "Isn't that the guy you're seeing?" Fatima had asked, according to what Nicole told me weeks later. Something about his location not matching what he told the insurance company the night of the accident with his daughter. Nicole told her it was probably nothing, a paperwork mix-up, the kind of thing that happens in every claim. Fatima shrugged and let it go, the way you let go of most break room gossip by the time you're back at your desk. But Nicole didn't let it go. She sat with it through 2 meetings that afternoon, she told me, running the date against a mental calendar only she had access to until the number landed somewhere it wasn't supposed to. Nicole didn't recognize the date at first. Then she did, because Daniel had told her, weeks before the funeral, that his marriage was already over, that Elena had agreed to separate months ago, and that introducing Nicole publicly, even at something as strange as a funeral, wouldn't be reckless, because there was nothing left to protect. He'd told her that so the funeral introduction wouldn't feel monstrous to her. It only worked as long as the timeline he'd fed her didn't touch the timeline he'd fed me. Fatima's gossip did exactly that. Nicole called Daniel that night, according to what she told me much later, and asked him a single question. When, exactly, did you tell Elena about us? He didn't have an answer that matched what he'd told her before. 2 days after that call, Nicole reached out to me directly. A message through a mutual acquaintance from Nora's school, asking if we could talk. I said yes, because by then I understood we weren't enemies. We were both people who'd been handed a version of one man's life that had been edited specifically to keep the other one calm. We talked on the phone for 11 minutes, both of us too careful to raise our voices, both of us circling the actual question for the first 4 or 5 of them. Nicole told me Daniel had said the marriage ended quietly months ago, and that he'd described me more than once as someone who'd checked out emotionally long before the divorce conversation ever happened, a description I recognized instantly, because it was the exact phrase Dr. Aldana had once used about his first affair, just aimed at me now instead of at him. He told me you knew," Nicole said, and her voice cracked on the word knew in a way that told me she wasn't lying, or at least not anymore. "He told me the funeral was going to be strange no matter what, so it didn't matter if I came." I asked her, as gently as I could manage, whether he'd ever given her a specific date for when this supposed conversation between him and me had happened. There was a long pause. "No," she said finally. "He never gave me a date. I never asked for one. I just believed him." I told her I understood exactly how that felt, because I'd believed a version of him too, for 19 years, and it had never once occurred to me to ask for a date either. In between all of that, Daniel tried, in his own way, to get ahead of what he could tell was coming loose. I know now, because Nicole eventually told me, that he called her twice that week, trying to smooth over the timeline question, telling her the toll discrepancy was Meridian's clerical error, that insurance companies flagged all kinds of things that turned out to be nothing, that she shouldn't let a claims adjuster with a quota make her doubt what they had. He didn't know yet that I'd already made the same call to Corvale's front desk, or that Julia had already told me to notice what I'd noticed. He was still operating, that week, as if the two timelines could be patched separately, the way he'd apparently patched them for 3 years. A little reassurance here, a little deflection there, never once accounting for what would happen if both women decided, independently and around the same time, to stop simply accepting the tone of an answer instead of the answer itself. The fifth crack was the one I built entirely myself, with my attorney's help, and it was the one that finally gave the whole shape of it a floor to stand on. I'd retained Diane Okafor, a family law attorney with 15 years practice, the week after the toll statement, telling myself it was precautionary, that I wasn't filing anything yet, I just wanted to understand my options. Diane listened to the timeline, the funeral, the two contradicting stories, the toll crossing, and said something I've thought about many times since. "You don't have a hunch, Elena. You have a pattern with one data point. Get the rest of the pattern before you say anything else to him." She helped me formally request, through the discovery process tied to the fault review Meridian was already conducting, Daniel's full 6-month Easy Pass history. It arrived as a 14-page PDF. I sat at our dining room table on a Sunday afternoon while Daniel was at the gym and went through it line by line, and the pattern wasn't subtle once I stopped hoping it would be innocent. 14 crossings at the Ashland Parkway Toll Plaza over 4 months, every one of them on a Thursday evening, every one of them logged between 6:15 and 7 p.m. I cross-referenced the dates against a Corvale corporate card statement Diane had also requested, a document neither of us technically had a right to yet, but which Meridian's investigator had already flagged as relevant, and which our discovery request happened to sweep in. 12 of the 14 Thursdays showed a charge from a business called the Cedar Line Inn, $189 each time, always posted between 8 and 9 at night. I confronted him that evening, the printed pages spread across the table like something out of the documentation trainings I'd sat through 100 times at the hospital, except this time the patient chart was my own marriage. He didn't recalculate this time. He got angry instead, the specific kind of angry men get when they've been caught and have decided the fastest way out is to make the accusation feel unreasonable. "You're doing this now? While we're burying our daughter? You're building a case against me?" His voice filled the kitchen in a way it never had before, not even during the counseling stretch 3 years earlier, and I felt something in me go very still and very cold instead of afraid. I told him I hadn't built anything. I'd just finally been allowed to see what was already there. He picked up the corporate card statement, looked at it for exactly as long as it took to confirm I wasn't bluffing, and set it back down without another word. He slept in the guest room that night. I sat up until almost 3 in the morning at the same kitchen table, going through the 14 pages one more time, not because I doubted them now, but because some part of me was still hoping, uselessly, that the 15th read-through would rearrange the dates into something survivable. It never did. I called Diane at 7 the next morning, before her office even opened, and left a voicemail asking her to call me back the moment she could. She called back in 9 minutes. Detective Alan Reyes, 19 years with the Ridgeview Police Department, had closed the original crash investigation within 2 weeks of the accident. Wes Granger's fault was never in question. The man had a blood alcohol content of 16 and 2 prior DUIs, and no detective was going to reopen a closed and clear vehicular homicide case over a father's confused alibi. But Meridian's fault review operated on a different lower bar than criminal law, and Priya Nadkarni's job wasn't to determine who caused the crash. It was to determine whether anyone else's decisions that night had contributed to the circumstances in a way that could shape the civil settlement. She requested a formal interview with Daniel. He gave her the stuck-in-a-meeting version. She requested his location data anyway, as she'd already told me she would, because that's simply what the process required regardless of what anyone said in an interview room. When the Ashland Parkway crossing came back with no corresponding meeting on Corval's calendar system, Priya's report noted the discrepancy in the flat, careful language of someone who has learned not to speculate in writing. Subject's stated location at approximately 1847 hours is not corroborated by employer calendar records. Subject's vehicle transponder places subject at a location inconsistent with stated itinerary. That single sentence, sitting in an insurance fault review file, became discoverable the moment Diane filed our civil claim documents, which meant it was now sitting in 2 separate case files, Meridian's and ours, each one accessible, eventually, to both women in Daniel's life. Diane explained it to me in her office with a level of patience I didn't deserve to still have access to. "This doesn't change who's at fault for the crash," she said. Wes Granger ran the light. Wes Granger was drunk. That part doesn't move. What it changes is what Daniel told you, and told Nicole, and told a claims investigator under something close to oath about a night your daughter died. Those are 3 different stories, Elena, and they can't all be true. And I think you already know which one is. Around that same time, I started seeing a grief counselor named Dr. Renata Osei, who Ridgeview Memorial's own employee assistance program had quietly connected me with 2 weeks after the funeral, back before any of the toll records had surfaced. I hadn't told her about the discrepancies at first. Grief counseling felt like a separate room from the folder I was keeping, and I wanted to protect at least 1 hour a week that wasn't about evidence. But by early April, I brought the EasyPass statement into her office without meaning to, still folded in my bag, and when she asked what I was carrying, I told her everything. Dr. Osei didn't tell me what to do with it. She asked me one question instead, sitting across from me with her hands folded the way therapists do when they want you to hear yourself answer. What do you actually need to know, Elena? Not what he did. You already have that. What do you need to know about why you're the one who has to be the one who finds out? I didn't have an answer for her that day. I think by the time the mediation rolled around 6 weeks later, I finally did. I needed to know because nobody else in Nora's life was ever going to ask the question on her behalf, and I was the only person left standing close enough to both women in that man's life to ask it twice. The mediation was scheduled for the 2nd week of May, technically a settlement conference tied to the civil wrongful death claim against Wes Granger's insurer, with Meridian's counsel and Daniel and myself and our respective attorneys all required to be present because, as the surviving parents, our sign-off was needed on any settlement figure. A retired judge named Franklin Doyle, who now made his living mediating exactly this kind of case, ran the session from the head of a long conference table on the 9th floor of a downtown office building, the kind of room with floor-to-ceiling windows that make everyone inside look smaller than they feel. He opened by reminding both sides, in the flat, unhurried voice of a man who had said the same sentence 1,000 times, that mediation worked best when everyone treated the number on the table as a business decision and saved the rest of it for somewhere else. I remember thinking, sitting there in my one good blazer with Diane's legal pad between us, that he had no idea how impossible that request was about to become. The number on the table that morning was $1.2 million. I had 18 hours notice that Daniel's location data was going to be raised formally in the room, because Meridian's counsel needed our position on record regarding whether we'd pursue a separate contribution claim against him, a possibility Diane had warned me was legally messy and emotionally worse, and one I'd told her, flatly, I had no interest in pursuing, because I understood, better than anyone in that building, that my daughter died because a stranger ran a red light drunk, not because her father lied about a hotel room. But Meridian's attorney, a sharp, unhurried man named Ivan Kessler, still needed the discrepancy addressed on the record before the settlement could close cleanly, because a plaintiff's own conduct history has a way of resurfacing in appeals if it isn't nailed down the first time. What none of us planned for was Nicole. She'd learned the mediation date from Daniel himself weeks earlier, before things between them had cracked, back when he was still telling her their timeline could survive contact with mine. She showed up in the lobby of the law office that morning, not to testify, not on anyone's list, just standing near the elevators in a gray coat, waiting, because she had her own question and she'd run out of ways to get Daniel to answer it honestly. When the mediation broke for a 15-minute recess and Daniel stepped into the hallway to take a breath, he found both of us there. Not by design, just 2 women who had each, separately, run out of patience for the version of him that only worked in isolation. Diane had prepped me for 2 hours the night before at her office, walking me through what Ivan Kessler was likely to raise and what he almost certainly wasn't. She'd labeled the toll statement Exhibit 4 in her own binder, the corporate card records Exhibit 5, Priya's discrepancy note Exhibit 6, everything numbered and tabbed the way it apparently gets numbered and tabbed once a private problem becomes a professional one. He's not going to ask you anything, she told me, tapping the binder closed. This isn't about you. It's about whether Daniel's own statements to Meridian create a chain of custody problem for the settlement, whether his version of that night can survive being compared to the record. You're not on trial in that room tomorrow, Elena. You're a witness to something that's already been documented. Let the documents do what documents do. I believed her mostly. I still barely slept. My phone had buzzed twice during the recess with texts from Julia asking how it was going. I hadn't answered either one. I had 24 hours of thinking about how I wanted this to go, and none of it prepared me for how quiet it actually was. Daniel's face when he saw us both, Nicole's coat, still buttoned, like she hadn't decided if she was staying, Franklin Doyle's assistant in the doorway, asking if everyone was ready to reconvene, having no idea what she was about to walk back into. Ivan Kessler, to his credit, didn't let the moment turn into a scene. He stepped between us and said evenly, Mr. Marsh, we need to address the transponder discrepancy on the record before we resume, and given that Ms. Ferris is present and appears to be a relevant witness to your location that evening, I'd ask that she join us as well. My hands had started shaking again, the same drop floor feeling from the funeral parlor, except this time I recognized it and let it happen instead of fighting it down. We went back into the conference room, all of us. Diane's hand briefly on my shoulder as we sat, Priya Nadkarni's printed report already sitting on the table between the water pitchers like something inert that was about to become very alive. Kessler read the line aloud. Subject's vehicle transponder transponder places subject at a location inconsistent with stated itinerary, and asked Daniel plainly where he actually was at 6:47 p.m. on March 3rd. Daniel looked at me first, then at Nicole. I watched him do the math out loud on his face. The same recalculation from the kitchen table, except this time there was no version left that could satisfy both women in the room at once, because we were, for the first time, both hearing the same question asked in the same breath. The room had gone completely silent, except for the low hum of the building's air handling system. And I remember noticing, in that strange way your brain fixates on irrelevant things during the moments that matter most, that Franklin Doyle had a water stain on the ceiling tile directly above Daniel's head, shaped almost exactly like the state we lived in. I was at the Cedar Line Inn, he said. His voice had gone flat, stripped of the salesman warmth I'd married. I was securing a room. That's why I texted Carol instead of picking Nora up myself. Nicole made a sound I will not try to describe, because it wasn't mine to describe, and Kessler, still working the room like a man doing his job, asked the next question anyway, the one that mattered most. And who was the room for? Daniel didn't answer that one. He didn't have to. Nicole answered it for him, in a voice that had gone completely level, the specific calm of someone who has just finished doing her own math. He told me Elena already knew about the divorce. He told me we were celebrating something. She looked at me, not at him. He told me the funeral was safe because there was nothing left to protect. I found out in that room, the second half of what I'd already suspected, that the same 49 minutes he'd spent lying to Carol about a meeting, he'd spent securing a hotel room he'd told his mistress, was a celebration of a marriage that, as far as I knew, hadn't ended yet. My daughter rode home with Carol Whitfield instead of her father, not because of a real client, not because of real traffic, but because her father was 41 minutes out of his way arranging a room at the Cedar Line Inn, and by the time Wes Granger ran that red light, Daniel was still there, and would have been there regardless of whether Nora made it home safely or not. The story didn't end in that conference room, even though it felt, for a long, ringing moment, like it should have. Ivan Kessler noted the admission for the file, and after a short private conversation with Diane, confirmed what she'd already told me, that Daniel's conduct that evening didn't reduce Wes Granger's liability by a single percentage point, because Granger's decision to drive drunk through a red light was a superseding independent cause no jury would ever apportion onto a father who was simply somewhere else. The $1, $2 million settlement closed 2 weeks later, entirely against Granger's insurer, exactly as it should have. What changed wasn't the crash. What changed was everything downstream of it. Nicole didn't wait for the mediation to formally end. She stood, collected her coat, and told Daniel, in front of all of us, that she'd be giving Priya Nadkarni a full written statement of her own, confirming the Cedar Line Inn booking under her name for that same evening, because she wasn't going to let him rewrite this a third time for whoever came after her. She did exactly that within the week. A signed statement, notarized, sitting now in Meridian's file as a second, independent confirmation that closed off any room Daniel might have tried to find to recast the story once the shock wore off. Fatima Delgado, whose idle lunchtime comment had started the whole final crack, went with Nicole to Corvale's HR office 3 days after the mediation. Nicole disclosed the relationship to compliance herself, given that Daniel was technically 2 levels above her in the reporting structure, and Corval placed him on administrative leave within the week pending an internal review. A director of human resources named Wanda Okoye, who I never met but who I've been told ran the internal investigation with the same flat thoroughness Priya Nadkarni brought to hers, pulled 18 months of expense reports as part of that review, and found a pattern of Thursday evening client dinner reimbursements that, once cross-referenced against Corvale's actual client visit logs, corresponded to no client anyone in the sales department could name. According to 2 Corvale employees who still occasionally forwarded me things, that review quietly became a resignation before it became a termination, because Roy Castellano had no appetite for defending a sales director whose own mistress had walked into HR ahead of him, and even less appetite for explaining 18 months of falsified expense reports to Corvale's finance department. Carol Whitfield called me the week after the mediation, once word had made its way to her the way it eventually makes its way to everyone in a town this size. She'd spent 2 months quietly blaming herself for taking the exit off Route 9 a minute later than she normally did, a detail she'd repeated to me at least a dozen times since March, always in the same apologetic voice she'd used from her hospital bed. I told her what I'd learned. There was a long silence on the line, and then she said something I've held on to since. He let me carry that for 2 months, Elena. He knew exactly what I didn't know, and he let me apologize to you for it anyway. She wasn't angry at me. She was angry at the specific, deliberate quiet of it. The same quiet that had let Nicole walk into a funeral home believing she was celebrating something. The same quiet Fatima's lunchtime comment had finally broken open. There was one more piece of news that spring, arriving almost as an afterthought against everything else. Wes Granger was sentenced in late June to 11 years for vehicular homicide while intoxicated. His second DUI-related offense counted as an aggravating factor. I sat in the back of that courtroom, not the front, because by then I understood that his sentencing and Daniel's unraveling were 2 entirely separate reckonings that happened to land in the same season. One for the man who killed my daughter, and one for the man who was supposed to be driving her home instead. Watching Granger let out in restraints didn't feel like the ending of anything. It felt like the one piece of the whole spring that had never actually been in question, sitting quietly at the center of everything else that had spiraled spiraled out around it. I filed for divorce 9 days after the mediation. Diane handled it the way she handled everything, carefully, without theater, on my terms and on my timeline instead of his. I didn't ask for revenge in the settlement. I asked for the house because Nora's room was in it, and I wasn't ready to be the one who left it. Daniel didn't fight me on much. I think by then, he understood that fighting only extended the number of rooms he'd have to sit in, while people asked him questions he couldn't answer twice the same way. At the funeral, Nicole had thanked me for finally letting him go. 8 months later, at the small gathering Diane's office called a final consent hearing, and I privately called the last room I'd ever have to sit in with him, I saw Daniel one more time, signing papers at the opposite end of a conference table, and I thought about that whispered sentence from the parlor floor. I never got to correct her that day, not properly. I'd needed her still trusting him a little longer back then, so she'd keep talking, so the second lie would surface next to the first one instead of staying buried under it. But I thought about it walking out of that building for the last time, past the same elevators where she'd been standing in her gray coat months earlier, and I understood, finally, that she'd actually been right, just early. He hadn't let me go that night at the funeral. I hadn't let him go, either. But somewhere between a toll booth 41 minutes out of his way and a signed statement in an insurance file, he'd let go of both of us, one lie at a time without ever meaning to, because he could never quite manage to remember which version of that Thursday he'd told to which woman in the room. Nicole and I still talk occasionally, though not often. She sent me a card in the fall, unprompted, with a single line inside it. "I'm sorry I ever thanked you for something that wasn't yours to give." I wrote back one line of my own. "You didn't owe me an apology." He owed both of us the truth, and he never once had it in him to pay that debt to either of us at the same time. I don't know if she needed to hear that. I know I needed to write it. I drove out to see Nora on what would have been her 17th birthday, the first one she didn't get, and I sat on the grass in front of her headstone for a long time before I said anything out loud. When I finally spoke, it wasn't the speech I'd planned in the car. I told her about the mediation, about the toll booth, about the sticky note she'd started in her binder that I'd never gotten to ask her about. And then, because it felt like the only honest way to close the loop she never got to see close herself, I said the two lines out loud, back to back, the way they'd sat in my head every day since March. "This is my future wife," and underneath it, quieter, "Thank you for finally letting him go." Neither one of them had been true when they were said to me. Both of them were true now, just not in the order either woman standing in that funeral parlor had intended. I told her that. I don't know if it counts as closure. It felt, at least, like finally being allowed to say the sentence out loud in a room where nobody was performing anything for anybody else. I still have Nora's chipped blue mug. It sits on my kitchen counter now, not her nightstand, because I moved it somewhere I'd see it every morning instead of somewhere I'd have to go looking for it. I make my coffee in it most days. I don't quiz myself on vocabulary words out loud the way she used to, but some mornings I say her name out loud instead, just once, just to hear it in the kitchen again. Diane tells me the civil case is fully closed now, that there's nothing left pending, that I don't have to keep the folder anymore. I haven't thrown it away. Some habits, once a job teaches them to you. Cross-reference before you trust. Document before you confront. Wait for the second data point before you say the sentence out loud. Don't leave just because the case does.